Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. We have got an interesting big old discussion for you today, and that is The Last of Us Part 2 sales performance. It is in, and man, they seem to have shifted a lot of copies of that game, especially as we then compare it to other Sonys and then other sort of multi-platform releases like the Grand Theft Autos, the Red Deads, and the Nintendos. Of course, Nintendo not being multi-platform, but having an extremely high attach rate for their hardware. Then, of course, we've got the interesting situation of, Jason Schreyer and Troy Baker, so Troy Baker plays Joel, getting into a strange situation that involves Theodore Roosevelt, so that's quite fun. And then the interesting situation of Sony PR, on behalf of Naughty Dog, reaching out to critical reviews, which happened in at least one case, which is a bit wild. So, there you go, that's what we're talking about today. If you would like to support this channel, I hear that only 50%, maybe even less, are actually subscribed, so you can hit that sub button. Of course, the like button helps too, and if you want to get a whole bunch of sweet art in your physical post box, and even a pin from our game art team, then you can check out the Patreon. Thanks, hope you enjoyed today's video, and let's get into it. Alright, so let's kick off today's shindig with the sales, because this is really important to talk about. So, despite the controversy that obviously happened, the countless videos, a few of those ours, that were in many ways critical about the game, well, it seems to have sold through 4 million units in 3 days. That's bloody insane. That is truly insane. Now, we can compare that to Smash Ultimate, which was the fastest seller for Nintendo, and that actually hit 5 million copies sold through in its first week, whereas The Last of Us Part 2 did 4 million in just 3 days. Though another big comparison is Animal Crossing, which was 11 million in 11 days, and, if The Last of Us Part 2 can outcompete that, I certainly would be shocked. Now, for one game that does actually beat it, and this is incredible, Monster Hunter World actually sold 5 million in 3 days, which just goes to show you how extremely well that game did. Now, it's kind of unfair to compare it to, say, like the Rockstar games, because no one makes them like Rockstar in terms of initial sales. Red Dead 2, 10 million in 2 days. Bloody hell. GTA 5, 12 million in the first day. So it's not as big as those big boys, but certainly for a Sony first party, remember, only on that console, an absolutely staggering result. And it really does take a spot in the elites in terms of its launch success, which certainly is quite interesting. Now, that said, it did have a lot of the scored reviews calling it a masterpiece. It had Sony's marketing campaign. My mum actually talked to me about the game and said, wow, if that was a TV show, I'd really be into it, but, I can't really play games. So, if the normies like my mum ended up knowing about this game got absolutely bloody everywhere. Now, that's actually not the whole story, because there is one additional thing. We're probably not going to hear updated numbers from Sony until the game hits some sort of other milestone, of course, but, right? Physical box sales, I believe in the UK, dropped by 80% after the first week. And this is something that's actually been reported around a lot. I don't think it means anything. To be completely honest with you, I think that this is a game that naturally would have a faster drop-off rate, because at the end of the day, the people who know they want that game, and it's a linear narrative game. There's not much, there's no replayability in it, essentially, so I don't really see the long tail existing for that game really in that manner, okay? So that's why I think that physical sales number is following general trends anyway in the market, and I think makes a lot of sense for a game like this. I mean, as another example, say Uncharted 4 actually had a similar drop in 2016 from our research. The market's only so big, really, for a game like this on that console only, so I guess it's going to have that really big upfront bump. And really, I think the thing here is we're never really going to know how much this controversy actually impacted the game, right? I would suspect for the vast majority of people, they wouldn't have even known that it happened, because turns out, right, there's 100,000 of us can watch a video like this sometimes. That is a lot less than the amount of people who actually will have purchased that game, especially because when something is news, well, yeah, there's the captive audience who are interested in watching The Last of Us Part 2 news, and they're not necessarily even people who are interested in the game. In the same way that game's memeage exploded on 4chan, and a quick look at, what the Channers were saying would sort of indicate that actually the Channers were never really into the first game anyway. So it's worth keeping all of that stuff in mind. And certainly, look, it is a game that I think is a deeply flawed script that I really did not think was really a game that had that much to say about anything. I really thought they bungled it, but they had a job to do, right? The studio had a job. It was to sell lots of copies of their game. They certainly did do that. So obviously, congratulations are in order. I think for me, I'm just a little bit worried that it represents a bunch of trends in modern writing that, are going to be validated by this success, and that does make me a little bit pessimistic, I suppose, as we go into the future. Now, that's our first thing to talk about, but there is another thing to talk about. That is the review controversy. So, Polygon did this article about how discussion about this game is a total minefield. Yeah, they're right. There you go. I agree with Polygon. Absolutely. It is a bloody minefield. No matter what you say, there's going to be some group of people who are not going to be particularly pleased about it. Now, what is interesting there is, they were talking about things like the strange embargo, right? Like they weren't able to talk about the Abbey switch in the middle of the game, which was a core thing for a lot of people that they really did care about, that heavily impacted people's perceptions on the game. So, yeah, relevant to a review, but also a major story spoiler. So it's kind of hard to know what you really do there. But they talked about that, and then they got into the thing that I think is way more interesting. And certainly for the people who've been talking about Access Media, I think this will be an interesting one. And that is Vice's review. It was by a guy called Rob Zacny, and he actually had, and his review was one of the unscored and more negative-leaning ones. And that's actually an interesting trend with this game. The scored reviews tended to be, in some cases, the shorter ones that were just a clean 5 out of 5, right? But the longer form reviews from the likes of Vice, Kotaku, and Polygon, those would be organizations that I would generally find myself a little bit more skeptical of when it comes to review content, but certainly I aligned a bit closer to them in this one. They generally had these longer form reviews that were unscored because they're all publications that I think, and respect to them, they don't really think review scores are a good thing, and I agree. And they were more negative leaning, which means that a lot of the actual critique that was going on from the commentariat, or the more sort of professional ones, right, the more respected ones you can maybe say, that wasn't actually captured by the Metacritic rating, and I think that is a pretty interesting thing. But anyway, so this Vice guy had his review. It was a little bit more in the negative, and he was contacted by Sony PR on behalf of Naughty Dog to ask him questions. Now, the reviewer said that he shared specific details with them on his opinion of the game and received a perfectly cordial message in response. Now, what is this? Is this a weird intimidation thing? Is this, them collecting feedback about the game? I mean, if it was, then, surely the review is what would have provided the feedback, not a PR wing of Sony reaching out to the reviewer on behalf of the company who made the game, but it certainly is a very strange thing. And this is a tactic that was actually brought up by Giant Bomb's Alex Navarro last week. And it was kind of hard to know if Alex actually was talking about the Vice reviewer, his own experience, or just generally this happening in the industry. But a lot of the responses to that original Polygon article do suggest that this is a not super common thing, but not a super uncommon thing. Now, this actually does lead me to a major story from Kane and Lynch. Yep, probably didn't think we were going to Kane and Lynch in today's video, but of course Alex Navarro is from Giant Bomb. You think of Giant Bomb, who do you think of? Founder Jeff Gerstmann. Now, Jeff Gerstmann was unceremoniously booted out of GameSpot because he gave Kane and Lynch Dead Men a 6 out of 10. But the thing is, GameSpot had an extreme advertising campaign running for the game, and because of that, he ended up getting fired because they had this big ad campaign and his review was critical of the game. He, of course, then went and founded Giant Bomb, who've been very influential. He did that along with 4 of GameSpot's largest editors. So really a pretty rough situation there. And overall with the reviews, to me, it is just interesting that Sony were reaching out. I think this is a thing we should probably know happens in the industry with the reviewers. It does make you think about Access Media, a lot of the thoughts people have had there. So certainly worth thinking about. But then as we move on, there is the other story. And this one, it, to me, almost goes into drama that I don't really care about and don't want to cover. But it does actually cover core creatives and core pillars of our industry. And I think that's why it is important to talk about. So in response to The Last of Us Part 2, basically, right, Jason Schreyer, he's a big man for his spicy takes on Twitter. A real spice boy is our Jason. And he tweeted games are too long, or video games are too long, right? And you know what? I kind of agree with him a lot of the time. I think a lot of games are like really bloated, and in the same way you could have a television show that might be great over 10 hours but just feels way too long and drawn out over 20. I think a bunch of games also have that. I'm somebody who puts value in experience, not in playtime. So I think that's what Jason was getting at, and certainly after playing The Last of Us Part 2, I felt that it was a really long, and if it was a TV show, I'd say it was pretty badly paced and edited. So I guess that's the thing, and I suppose they were sort of trying to be a TV show or a movie when you think about how Naughty Dog craft their sort of interactive narrative experiences, right? Now, there was one guy who did not take particularly well to what Jason said, and that is Troy Baker. You know Troy Baker. He's Booker DeWitt from BioShock Infinite. He is, of course, Joel from The Last of Us. He is, Death Stranding, right? He is one of those guys who just gets all the roles. And, I do respect him a great deal. He's a fantastic voice actor, one of the best in the business, right? But he tweeted, this is, I think, a weird cultural disconnect where he's taking something very personally. But in response to what Jason did, he tweeted a he tweeted a Theodore Roosevelt quote about how basically, to summarize it, right? And it is a very interesting quote. It's, one a lot of us have seen before, but, the quote about how really the value of the creator is higher than the value of a critic because it's the creator who's really putting themselves on the line. And in many ways, I do actually agree with Troy there. It takes a lot more to make a movie than to write a review of it. Absolutely. But at the same way, you can't use that as a shield to deflect criticism, because if you want to grow as a creative and make better media or better, content in the future, you're going to want to learn and grow. And that involves listening to the critics, not just sort of, doing this, I suppose, Troy, which is a bit rough. So yes, it felt very reductive and defensive, to put it lightly. And I think reaction criticism in this way is really a bad look for a professional, even more so when it's not directed at him, because I don't think anyone was saying that Troy Baker gave that game a bad performance or delivered his lines badly or acted Joel badly. He did all of those things exemplarily, fantastically. But it's clear that he's very emotionally attached to this game. So it's clear that Troy wasn't really just taking things, I think, in a healthy manner with the criticism. Maybe he was taking them quite personally. Now, to be fair, I will say there was a lot of BS criticism, right? Ellie's sexuality and Abby's just nature as a character. I don't think that those things are really big points of criticism, right? I mean, even Abby being totally shredded. In the game, you actually walk past her gym and you're in her compound where it's clear that they've actually got a massive farm and just endless supplies of, not endless, but lots of supplies of food. So her being a bodybuilder, does make a bit more sense in that context, right? Because they do actually establish that in the game. So it's like, those are not the problems I had with the game while I was playing it. The problems that I had with the game were, themes, characters, plot, motivations, things like that. Not a lot of those criticisms that are just being lightly thrown out. And I think maybe there's a situation where Troy can't separate the wheat from the chaff there, and he's really struggling, perhaps. And I'll say that being a professional critic is also difficult. I think being a creator is harder, but when you're being a critic, I mean, you are putting yourself out in the line. And there's another thing that Alana Pierce mentioned in her video from last month, and that is that when you're writing a review, you're writing that for an audience. So then as a critic, you're kind of beholden in a way, or at least you've got to navigate the sort of the motivations of your audience and what they actually want, right? Going against the grain of your audience can actually have an impact on your future, or going against the grain of your fellow reviewers. That can maybe also have an impact if you're, say, in an industry where respect really does matter. So maybe if you're wanting to do the game journalism game, right, and, you kind of have this big dissenting review that people don't agree with, and then they sort of disrespect you for it, you can see how those things are also just the tricky waters to navigate as a critic, especially, I would say, in a more institutional setting. Whereas in YouTube, I mean, we're free to blabber our mouths about anything, aren't we? Now, that's got lots of pros, and of course, it's got cons as well. So I think this whole discussion, it's been hurt by noise. I think that this situation is not really a good look. It does make me worry that a bunch of people who are thought leaders in our industry maybe won't learn lessons that I think would really be good if we all learned them. And it's just this sort of sad situation where it's really hard to have a good faith discussion in public. And I would say that, maybe Jason Schreyer doing his sort of spicy hot take isn't the most productive way of talking about that more long-form idea about length in games and editing and the value of experience versus the value of playtime. But then in the same way, the way that Troy responded isn't exactly in good faith, right? So it really is quite messy, especially when you then tie it into one of Jason Schreier's, sort of editorial interests being in the coverage of how companies like Naughty Dog have treated their staff. And that does make it all quite a bit more challenging. And then, of course, there's also just blatant baiting, right? Like, there was a Polygon article, let me just get it here, that says, yes, The Last of Us Part 2 proves gaming doesn't know how to deal with muscular women. Now, everyone knows that headline was designed to do, right? To fit some expectations and incite anger. And, I mean, look, if you know a certain type of gamer, yeah, you know, characters like Abby are going to be fervently celebrated. For what it's worth, I think the criticisms level at Abby come from primarily 3 different places. I think there are bad faith actors, right, who are attacking the game based on that, sort of for the fun, for the banter, for the memes. There's then people who are using Abby as a scapegoat for bad direction and bad writing because maybe it's just hard to communicate exactly, specifically what feels wrong about the way that plot line went. And I think Abby is the personification of the way that plot line went, so that's I think a reasonable enough thing to feel anyway. And then I think, yeah, there's just some people who, you know, more genuinely were like, in a post-apocalyptic world, how could somebody be this buff? And the thing is, the body of that article from Polygon actually goes through all of those viewpoints and deals with them decently well. It's just that it had that baity headline out there, which kind of just contributed to the noise and made it harder to talk about these things. So there you go. I think that really is it for this video. I mean, to end it, that's kind of how things are going with The Last of Us Part 2. As we look forward into the future, what's up next? Well, Ghost of Tsushima. That is a game that I think is going to be an absolute blockbuster for Sony. I think it is going to do so damn well in terms of sales. It may be, you know, I don't know if it'll be as large as The Last of Us Part 2, but certainly Sony I think they're set up for another massive win. So, an interesting situation all around. I would love to know, though, from you, what do you think about the cultural discourse of this game? I think that's number 1 thing that I want to know. Number 2, the sales, right? Did you buy it? What do you think about those sales? And yeah, I mean, just the sort of reviews angle. What do you think about that? Because it is interesting to me that the outlets that didn't do scores, that did longer form reviews, seem to be the ones that skewed a bit more negative. Outside of, funny enough, IGN Japan, who gave it a 7 out of 10, or 70 out of 100, which is quite funny because, you know, it's IGN, and they are typically ridiculed for their big 10 out of 10s. Anyway, there you go, that's it for me. Let me know what you thought down below. Thank you for listening to this video, and I'll see you next time.